I'm Sam Lewis, and I'm doing the March video topic analysis for Champion Briefs this month. To keep in mind, this is just an overview of the topic. For a better overall understanding, I would both highly recommend reading through the brief this month. I think it has a lot of very high-quality arguments and information that will be helpful for debaters. And secondly, as well, just do your own research and make sure to supplement these things that I'm saying, right? Don't take everything I say for granted. I'm not an expert in the field of college funding, and I don't really claim to be, but I think it'll be helpful regardless. With that in mind, we'll be covering a few things in this topic analysis. First, general definitions and explanations of the resolution and different words in it. Second, background information on the idea of the resolution and the general arguments that might be involved. Third, strategies and framing. Fourth, general arguments that you might hear. And then fifth, tournaments of concern and judge adaptation methods that kind of go hand in hand with those tournaments that you might need to expect and work around. With that in mind, let's get straight into it, right? So the resolution is resolved in the United States. Students should be guaranteed 2 years of free tuition to a community or technical college. This is right in the spirit of public forum, directly ripped straight off the headlines. This is something that President Obama proposed as a plan and then brought it up directly in his State of the Union address, right? So in light of that, this topic should be pretty easily researched with just a quick Google search. On that same note, though, because it is something that has been so highly publicized, a large amount of the things you will be getting when you commit to those Google searches will be op-eds and various news articles, and a lot less of like quantifiable studies from think tanks. So when you're trying to develop your cases and find research and evidence for different arguments, I would recommend, although op-eds and news articles are good, try to as well look for things like those quantifiable and good studies that might be able to have better warrants and better backing up for your claim. I might be able to better back up your claims. Let's go straight into the general definition and explanation sections, though, of this debate and of this resolution. So, starting off, it says in the United States, right? So in the United States, students should be guaranteed 2 years of free tuition to a community or technical college. This United States aspect is pretty important, although it might be kind of underplayed by some debaters, because it means that obviously these arguments, the impacts need to be restricted domestically. This differs from some older resolutions. For instance, one a few years ago that was the cost of the college education outweigh the benefits, where it allowed some debaters, myself included, to run some squirrely arguments about things like the education system in China, which aren't really in the spirit of the debate, and this precludes that from happening. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that foreign examples can't be brought up, right? So if you can find other countries and other nations that have implemented free education systems or have had heavy regulations on their community college systems and it was good or bad, feel free to mention that and be like, look, we don't want to do this, or we do want to do this in the United States because X happened in Y country. Now, so really, though, you can bring up foreign examples, just make sure to limit your actual impacts and your actual arguments in the debate to the United States and domestics, because that's what the resolution is asking. Secondly, in the United States, students should be guaranteed 2 years of free tuition to a community or technical college. This should part is actually relatively important to, I think, the arguments people are going to be bringing up. It stresses the idea that this should be a normative debate weighing the pros and the cons of this plan, assuming it can be implemented, right? So that way you don't have teams coming up and bringing up political capital or feasibility arguments saying, no, this isn't feasible because Congress won't pass it, or the Democrats and the Republicans will argue a lot. I think normative debates tend to be better for judges, because judges then probably enjoy hearing a lot more about the actual merits of arguments rather than whether or not it'll lead to political gridlock, and it's just a more fun and educative experience for the debaters as a whole. So I think this is pretty important. The next word I thought might be of question is guaranteed. So it said students should be guaranteed 2 years of free tuition to a community or technical college. The guaranteed here kind of implies that everyone should be getting this. Whether or not it's conditional or not is questionable, right? So if this resolution is talking about President Obama's plan that he brought up in the State of the Union and a few days before, then there will be actual regulations on what's going to be given to these students and under what grounds people will be receiving that, and I'll address that in the background information section of this video in a second. Or debaters can stress, no, we're not talking about President Obama's plan because we're guaranteeing this to all United States citizens or all people in the United States, because the resolution says guaranteed and not conditionally awarded or something along those lines. The last aspect of the resolution to maybe talk about is community or technical college. Most people know what a community college is. It tends to be in smaller towns, or maybe in large areas, but they tend to award 2-year associate's degrees, not 4-year bachelor degrees, which is what 4 universities and colleges tend to award instead. Or in technical schools and technical colleges tend to be classified as trade or vocational schools. They're unique in that they tend to emphasize a specific trade, generally in the STEM field, but not restricted or limited to that. And that's where they're a little bit different from other 4-year universities. And that's important to acknowledge because the technical schools actually have an entire other breadth of literature that a lot of people don't look into, because a lot of people will focus and heavily emphasize this topic on the community college aspect. You don't need to limit it to that. You can talk about these other things that the resolution is allowing for to be debated, technical colleges included. So, let's get straight into the background information then. Background information on this resolution. I think it's pretty obvious that this resolution was brought up and was decided on by the NSDA. I don't speak for them, but I'm pretty sure why, is because President Obama's proposed plan, right? So let's go over that plan and what its bases are and what those conditions I was talking about earlier for students to get this aid and how that money is going to be getting here. So President Obama's plan is essentially a larger scale version of laws that are already in place in states like Tennessee, and a smaller scale law that is, I think, focused in Chicago. So these are far more localized, and President Obama's plan is supposed to be more federal and overarching, which is what the resolution is asking, because it's saying in the United States and not in one section of the United States. So some conditions inside President Obama's plan say that students can be awarded this free tuition under the condition that they have a GPA of over 2.5, that their families are making less than $200,000 a year, so they're trying to focus this on more middle class and poorer families. And then moreover, he says that community colleges will only be eligible to participate in this program if they're making sincere efforts to reduce the needs for remedial classes for these students coming out of high school. So they're trying to basically say, make sure these colleges and these community and technical schools are making sincere steps forwards on these students' education. They don't want to be awarding this free tuition and just have these community colleges waste it and not actually help those students. The way that the plan intends on paying for these programs is that the federal government will fund 75% of it and states will pay for 25% of it. Most opponents here will be emphasizing the fact that this cost a lot of money, like $1.4 billion, I think is the number that was estimated sometime over the next decade. Proponents of the plan will say that, this, even though it might be costly to the government, it will save students and these poor families a lot of money, which is extremely important, as well as the fact that this billions of dollars isn't really that much when split across all 50 states over a decade. It's actually not that big of a number in the grand scheme of things, so it shouldn't be something to be afraid about. Obviously up for debate and can be argued about on several different facets in the actual arguments. And I'll talk a little bit about that when I'm getting onto the general arguments section of this video. And in light of these costs, right, that's actually why these plans are being implemented. The other important aspect of this background information on the topic is understanding why these things are even being debated about in the first place, and that's the fact that the cost of college in recent years has been increasing drastically, right? And with that increase in cost has been a largely increased amount of debt and loan debt that students are having when they're leaving colleges, right? Which is actually a large reason why people are increasingly choosing community colleges. They're much cheaper. Their costs have been increasing to a shorter degree, to a lower degree. This is why 40% of students now choose community college when going into their higher level education system, as opposed to 4-year universities. And in light of all of these college-age students and these students going to college, the job market is increasingly requiring degrees for people to actually get jobs and become employed. With all this background information in mind, right, the idea behind this plan and the reason why they're even being discussed in the first place, I think you can get straight into the strategies and arguments, right? Strategies and framing of the round. And we can break this into 2 different sections, the pro and the con, the 2 different sides of the debate. I think that's pretty straightforward. So let's get into the pro section, right? So pro, strategies, and framing. So starting on frameworks. I think the pro frameworks that can be proposed will be amongst a few different lines, mostly based in weighing. So the way that people will be weighing the rounds. I think the first one might be, for instance, the first one to note might be the idea behind weighing benefits to the poorer populations in the United States above everyone else, seeing as these tend to be the people that college will benefit most on the margin, and these poorer families are the ones that are generally like focused on when these plans are implemented, right? Community colleges tend to help poor people more because they're so cheap, and community colleges and college as a whole, college educations, tend to benefit lower income families more because higher income families don't need as much money, right? So if the pro can emphasize that, look, we're helping this this part of America that needs the most help, you can very easily emphasize that to your judges, and I think have a pretty good weighing mechanism. And if you explain that that's what these plans are targeted towards, right? That's what these college, like the lowering cost of college plans are targeted towards, is helping these poor Americans, then I think that the pro can very easily use this as a weighing mechanism that will help them in the round. On that same note, another kind of weighing mechanism that you can use is just saying, any increase in education is extremely important, should be weighed heavily, right? So like if they show a net increase in education, the pro wins the round. I think this framework is pretty easily argued and pretty easily convincing considering your audience, right? So most of the time, the people judging these rounds will be people like parents of students and then teachers at schools, or people working at schools, or people heavily involved in the school system. You are at a debate tournament after all, right? So these people being as invested in education as they are will likely value an increase in education on the net very highly, especially considering this resolution is all about college and college education. So, if the pro stresses this framework, says education is good, we are showing a net increase in it, we win the round, I think it'll be a pretty good strategy for them. Not necessarily one that they have to go for, but I think it'll be a good framework. The last one, for instance, that you can do on the pro side, and this can also be used on the con actually, is the idea behind weighing the round from the point of view of a prospective college student, right? So look at this, look at the round, and look at all the impacts provided from both teams through the eyes of a student potentially applying to college and trying to decide what to do, right? So if you put it that way, it changes the round quite a bit, because then on an individual basis level, a person might not be looking at the large-scale cost to the government when they're looking to apply to college, right? So the pro can try to minimize and mitigate impacts that the con brings up pertaining to, for instance, this $1.4 billion cost, or like, for instance, increased taxes from the government, because that individual level analysis might say you as a prospective college student really just want to go to school and get a better education, and the pro side is the best at providing that. And they're providing it for a very low cost to free, right? So the pro achieving this impact through that weighing mechanism should win in the round on a pretty regular basis. On that idea, once we've gotten past these kind of various frameworks that I think might be brought up, it's also important to acknowledge like important strategies to keep in mind on the pro side. So I think that almost all impacts from the pro are going to be predicated on the fact that people are going to be going to college more. It'll be saying college is good, we get people into college. On that idea, this means that it's extremely important for pro teams to prove that link to increase community college enrollment, right? You need to prove that people are going to be going to college more, that enrollment is going to increase on the pro side to get your impacts. And this link is pretty easily proven. You say that the cost goes down, and when the cost goes down, it decreases the barriers to entry. People are more likely to be capable of going to college. People will be more likely to be incentivized because they won't see these major costs other than a time commitment, and that's extremely important. Because if you're getting that increased enrollment, then you can get all the benefits of college. So that's an extremely important aspect of your strategy. You need to prove an increased enrollment to get most of your impacts on the pro. Do not sidestep that, or just assume that people will accept that that's true. I would almost recommend putting that maybe as part of like the overview at the top of your case. Set forth this link saying, look, we're increasing enrollment to college. Maybe your contentions can be the different benefits of college. That's just one option, but it's a way that you can ensure that you demonstrate and show this link in your case. The other aspect of your strategy on the pro that I think might be might be like downplayed by a lot of articles and things you might be reading are the vocational and trade and technical school aspect of this resolution, right? So most research you look into will be focused on community college, especially in light of President Obama's recently pronounced plan that is mostly focused on community college. In light of that, I think that most con responses will be focused on community colleges as well, right? They'll be focused on the pros and cons of community college, and it won't be focused on the vocational school aspect. So if you as the pro emphasize that vocational schools and technical schools are extremely beneficial, maybe even more beneficial than community colleges, right? And that they're uniquely better because they specifically train you for jobs and specifically prepare you for the job market, as opposed to just getting you a degree that might not necessarily actually get you anywhere in the workforce, you can sidestep a lot of the cons responses and a lot of the cons arguments. Because if the cons responses might be great, but if they're focused on community colleges, you can just say, that's not responsive to our argument, we're talking about vocational schools here, and my opponents never demonstrate why they are bad. It's also important to acknowledge that because vocational schools are becoming increasingly popular, but haven't been, there isn't much literature about them, most of the literature about this new facet of our education system is extremely positive, right? It thinks that they're pretty beneficial for the students that go there. So at that point, you're not going to be finding many things that say vocational schools and trade schools are bad. So you can you can collapse in on this and emphasize how great they are, and your opponents are going to have a much harder time responding to that than the community college aspect of the resolution. So I would not, when writing cases, completely ignore that aspect. I would still definitely remember and keep in mind that technical college aspect of the resolution when writing your arguments and working through the debate. So let's go into con strategies then, and frameworks as well. So con frameworks, I think first of all, con can be easily emphasizing the long-term over the short-term in today's debate. The obvious impacts as to why that's going to be, the obvious reasons as to why the con will want the long-term debate over the short-term is because a lot of the con's impacts are seen in the long term. For instance, things like the cost of college goes up because of the increased demand that will result from this free community college, or the idea that it'll lead to spending instability in the government, or loan bubble arguments pertaining to students taking out loans. A lot of these arguments aren't necessarily seeing short-term impacts, right? You're not going to see the increase in four-year college, increase in cost in four-year colleges skyrocket immediately when this plan is in place. It's going to be more of a gradual process. So if the con can say, we need to look to the long term over the short term, because when we're looking to the long-term stability in the United States and our long-term education abilities, that's going to impact us more, then clearly most of their impacts are going to be seen more in the long term than the short term. So basically that's just a framework that the con can emphasize a little bit more heavily, and I think it'll work well in their favor because most of the pros impacts, for instance, we get more people in school, will be short term if the con shows this increase in cost or increased instability in the education system. Anything into that. The other framework here the con can emphasize is the quality of education over the quantity of education. So this is really helpful in response to the entire pro argument that, look, we're getting more people into college and that's just good, we win right there. The con can emphasize things like, it's not good to put more people into college if that college system is degrading, if we're overloading it with the amount of a new surplus of students that these colleges weren't prepared to handle. Or, for instance, if you're pulling people out of four-year universities, that might be better for them. So at that point, if you're hurting the quality of these students' education, it's not necessarily good just to have more people in the education system. So if the con can emphasize that sort of weighing mechanism through their framework, I think they'll be able to outweigh a lot of the pros impacts that are just saying, we get more people into college and that's a good thing. On that idea of weighing, right, it's also important to look at these strategies for the cons round. So, akin to the pro strategies that's saying you need to prove the link to increased community college enrollment, I think it will be extremely helpful for the con to attack that link, right? So part of your strategy, I think, should be attacking that link on increased community college enrollment, emphasizing things like the true barrier to entry to community colleges aren't things like tuition, which is what this resolution is allowing you to get for free, but rather things like textbook costs or opportunity costs that mean these students could be going into the job market instead, right? Time dedication is pretty important. So at the point that they're not actually proving an increase in enrollment in community college, then they're losing a large amount of their impacts if their impacts and contentions are mostly college is good, right? So if all of their arguments are predicated on more people are going to college, and college is good, if you disprove that more people are going to college aspect, you kind of win the round right there. So you can put an overview if you want, for instance, at the top of your rebuttal. Just like at the top of the con team's rebuttals, put an overview at the top of their case, say, look, unless they prove there's an increased amount of people going to college, they basically lose all of their impacts and you default to our side. Because in terms of the government, right, you don't want the government committing to actions if they're wasteful and they don't really lead to any real benefits. It's just a waste of money at that point, and it doesn't really lead to any help to Americans. On that note, and like a strategy that the con can also go for here is feel free to go for the old, like, if this round turns out to be a wash or if these arguments turn out to be a wash, default to our side, because our side is the status quo, right? Inaction is preferable to action with the government if the action doesn't lead to any real benefits, because otherwise there's obvious cost for the government to committing to things. For instance, a waste of money that could have been put to other aspects of our educational system. In line with that money could have gone somewhere else idea, the last strategy I think the con can be emphasizing is the idea that opportunity costs are important as well, right? So on this overview that you might be able to put in your rebuttal, you can say, A, my opponents must prove that there's an increased number of people going to community colleges. There needs to be an increase in enrollment for them to get their impacts in today's round. Second, they must show that community colleges are actually good. So then in your rebuttal, you can proceed to go down and refute their benefits of college. And then lastly, they need to show not only that community college is good, but that it's preferable to the other options available. So if students can instead be going directly into the workforce, that might be better for them than going to community college, getting a degree, and then going into the workforce, right? So if the con team heavily emphasizes opportunity cost as being important, it can just be another tier of those, like, you can just be another tier to this overview, another tier to those kind of requirements for the pro team to prove in order to win the round. The con can kind of put a lot of burdens on the pro in this aspect without sounding too abusive, because those all sound like reasonable requests. Prove that your impacts and links are real, and then prove that they're like an optimal way for these students to act. So at that point, I think most of these strategies and frameworks have been covered here. Let's go straight into the general arguments. Once again, start with the pro. So, pro team's general arguments, I think, like I said, will mostly be like on the idea college is good, here's a bunch of benefits from going to college. And this can be broken into two parts. I think there's two different types of benefits that people talk about when they talk about benefits of college. The first of which is on the individual level, and the second is on the systemic level. So we'll start on the individual, right? They talk about, for instance, that students who go to college get better job opportunities, higher wages, better standards of living. Like, education is innately and intrinsically good because people know more about the world, or maybe they have better health after they get more educated and they make better decisions. The systemic level is the idea behind a more educated populace has less crime. You have reduced cost to society because you have less poverty. Health charges go down in your healthcare system. You're more globally competitive as a nation when you have a smarter community. Your government then capably achieves its goal of helping its population when it reduces poverty and improves health. And like maybe people volunteer more when they go to college more, right? So these are all ideas on the basic concept that college is good and here's a bunch of good impacts from it. Once again, these are all predicated on the idea that you're seeing an increased number of people going to college, something I emphasize is extremely important part of the pro strategy. Responding to this can be pretty easy if that link is beaten down, but also on the idea that the con team can also emphasize that the quality of college will go down, which I'll address when I'm talking about the con argument in a second. So if the con says, yeah, so these benefits might be great, college might be good, but they're hurting the quality of college, they're not achieving these impacts as beneficially and as efficiently as they were previously because of this new system, then the con team can effectively respond to this argument. Then the second aspect of this argument can be, and the second argument that the pro can kind of argue on this idea is like improved quality of the college education system. Maybe they can say that the economic diversity that would result from having all these new people going to community colleges will allow for increased networking opportunities, or it means that people of power might be more invested in these community college systems, so they may be more likely to improve it or see the problems that they weren't previously seeing. Because now, when you have more people going into these community college systems, systems, you're more likely to have some voice coming out of that system in the government and in policy that might allow for a change for the better. So that can counteract that con argument that says the system's quality goes down with more people, and it also acts as a snowball effect, kind of multiplier effect for that first argument provided, because if college is innately good and it gets people better job opportunities, etc., 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 but it also is being improved because of this system and because of this new plan that allows for economic diversity and an increased voice in government, then that's even better. You're getting more and more impacts, and you're just taking those older ones and making them even bigger in the round. Con arguments, I think, are slightly more diverse, which is where the con might be able to get some ground in today's debate, because the pro is a little bit limited. They're restricted to arguing that college is good and that people are going to be ideally going to college more, unless they're running some very strange argument about how people are going to be going to college less now that it's free and college is bad, which I doubt. I don't think that's going to be a realistic way to run anything in today's round. So because of that, con has a lot more ground. They can argue things like opportunity cost or practical harms of college or anything along those lines, and because of that, they might be able to have more diverse cases. Some general arguments that con can go for, though, are things like opportunity cost, which I think has already been mentioned, right? So on the individual level, individuals might be able to go to four-year universities instead, and if they're being dragged out of those and disincentivized from going there because they have this free community college option, that's an argument that con can pretty heavily emphasize and say, look, we're pulling people out of this better system. Why would we do that? This is an opportunity cost, and it's really important. But also they can say, not going to college is preferred. We don't want people going into community college when it's free because it's better for them to go straight into the workforce, where they'll immediately be able to start working up the social ladder and start climbing up their particular businesses, management level, ladder as well. They can move from that tiny worker to the manager to higher up in the corporate ladder. So going straight into the workforce might be preferable to going to college, especially considering all of the arguments against the benefits of the college education system. For instance, the idea that people are becoming underemployed and they're not getting jobs necessarily that the degrees say they should be getting. The second level of opportunity cost is on the government level. This ties into the entire idea that the government might be able to spend this money in separate ways, especially considering those massive costs I brought up earlier, upwards of $1 billion. That's quite a bit of money that it might be able to put into better areas. It might be pulled out of preferable areas, for instance, other aspects of the education system. Or it might come from new taxes that are bad for the economy. On that same idea, the other opportunity cost aspect might be on the idea of political capital. I said that this kind of degrades from the quality of the round when you start talking about gridlock and that sort of thing, but if your opponents decide to go into this argumentation, I think it's good to be prepared for it. So it's possible people might be saying that this plan is bad. This plan behind giving people free community college is bad because our government can only, our Congress basically can only handle so many controversial bills. And when we implement this one, it stops us from passing a better bill, because then in the future, Republicans or Democrats will be able to say, well, I would do that, but I already let you pass this bill, which I didn't like. And in this case, this bill would be very controversial inside the United States Congress, so it would likely result in a large loss of political capital. The second argument con can bring up is the idea behind, for instance, devaluing degrees. If every single person is going to school now, like the pro is trying to claim, if they see this increase in enrollment and everyone's getting degrees, that's not always a good thing. You're devaluing the degree, right? When there's a higher supply, the price of these things go down. In that same vein, right, let's go back to The Incredibles, right? Like the old Disney movie, if everyone's super, then no one is. If everyone has these degrees, what's to make you different from everyone else? So in that vein, if everyone's getting these degrees and everyone's enrolling in college, you're not really getting any benefit from the degrees. It's better to just go straight into the workforce rather than just be this non-special person with the same degree and same 2-year associate's degree as every other high school graduate in the nation. Another argument the econ can go for is increased costs. So the idea that now that you have a bunch of people going into college and you see this increased demand, the system is likely to increase the cost of the college system. For instance, when community colleges recognize that people are now able to better afford textbooks because they're getting their tuition for free, they're going to increase the cost of their textbooks, or maybe housing, or anything akin to that. So at that point, the general cost of this college is increasing, it might actually increase the barriers to entry and not decrease them, which is bad if the pro team is trying to say that more people going to college is good, and the con can then say, no, less people are going to college because there's an increased barrier to entry. They can also say that it increased the cost to four-year universities, the con can, because they can say, look, the government's diverting funds from other from four-year universities that they might have previously been putting into it to now pay for this new plan, or maybe students are leaving them for community colleges, and to compensate for the loss in students, four-year universities need to increase their tuitions. So there's obvious increase in costs that could result, and that might be bad. The last argument I think Con can go for is systemic overload. The idea that as you have more people joining the community college system, it decreases access to resources, right? So you have increased classroom sizes, which is not good for the education process. It diverts funds, for instance, from other school funding. So, for instance, the government plan here and the state plan that 25% the state needs to pay for during this free community college plan might be taken out of, for instance, paying for counselors for these students or advisors. You might be put into buying more chairs for all this influx in students. And that's not necessarily better for the education experience for these students because they don't have those advisors, so they don't have good food or a nice campus. Their overall experience at the college is going to be degraded and it won't be good. It's also important to note, though, if you run this argument, you make this you do commit to conceding this link to increased enrollment. If you run this, you're saying, and you're accepting the fact that the pro team is getting more people to go to college. So if you don't want to run that risk, and you don't want to concede that link, you might not want to run this type of argument that says the system gets overloaded and that's bad, because you might not want to concede that the pro is getting more people into college, because then it makes the pro winning the round a lot easier because they can just say, my opponents concede that they're getting more people into college, now let's look at whether or not the quality of the education actually goes down to the point that this counteracts the major benefits we provide in our case, and they can just laundry list benefits from going to college that they're now getting all these new people to go to. Alright, so I think it kind of covers general arguments and strategies. Let's go over ground split. Just to summarize these arguments and these arguments then. So, I think although when you originally read this resolution, it seems very skewed towards the pro. This fantastical idea that you have this great thing where people can now go to college for free sounds pretty enticing, and I think it's something that appeals to a lot of people. I think a deeper amount of research, though, reveals a lot of impacts that the con can make, especially in terms of the con rebuttal, where you can result to a diverse amount of impacts, and you have a lot of responses that the pro doesn't necessarily have the same capability of giving. With that in mind, though, I still think the pro might be able to better appeal to lay judges, because lay judges are people that might be invested in the education system, like I brought up earlier. Teachers really like to hear, yeah, let's make America smarter, let's make sure people get to school because school is good. It sounds like an innately and intrinsically good thing, and if the pro can emphasize that to lay judges, they might have a little bit of an advantage there. On the idea of lay judges, let's talk about the last aspect of this topic overview and topic analysis, which is on the idea of tournaments of concern and judge adaptation methods with that in mind. So, although some states have already had their district tournaments, I was from North Carolina. North Carolina already has theirs. Theirs is pretty early in the year. I think most of the time March tournaments tend to be district and state tournaments. That's what's most commonly found in March. Actually, I don't know of any large-scale national circuit tournaments that result until TOCs and CFLs and NSDAs after Harvard, which is at the end of February. So with that in mind, I think most of the time debaters will understand and know their local judges and circuit styles better than I do, but the advice I can give is that, at least when I debated, local judges tend to, traditionally speaking, prefer a slower and more conversational style of debate. With that in mind, always prefer quality of arguments over quantity, right? Especially considering how interlooking every single argument in this topic is, right? In-depth comparative analysis in speeches like the rebuttal and the summary, I think will be very preferable to giving 10 responses to an argument your opponents provide, even if I had the tendency to go for the latter and try to go for giving all those responses. Actual analysis and explanation, probably the better route to go here on this topic. With that in mind, I would really, really heavily stress to explain warrants well, right? You have a lot of arguments that intertwined with each other, right? When you talk about an increased cost to the college education system and these increased textbook costs, your opponents can point out, but increased textbook costs don't matter if they're making more money from increased incomes from the better jobs they're going to be getting from getting these degrees. Then you can say, no, you're not getting a better degree because your degree is going to be devalued when everyone has one because everyone's going to college now, right? See how confusing and kind of jumbled that gets. I think it's going to be important to explain warrants for each argument extremely well, and that's something you can kind of default to. You can say, Judge, because there's so much the round so far has been such a jumbled mess, let me just clarify the explanations for each argument and explain why we're winning. And I think if you do that well and crystallize well in your final focus and summary, it will be winning you the round almost every single time. And lastly, weigh early and weigh often. If you have important weighing mechanisms, like saying, let's look to the long term or the short term, or let's look at this from the point of view of a prospective college student, that's not something in this type of debate you will want to be bringing up in the final focus, especially considering lay judges. It's a lot better to emphasize those sorts of things early, sometimes as early as the constructive speeches. At the bare minimum, I would say bring it up at the top of the rebuttal. Do not wait any later than that. Bring that up then, so that way you can say, look, Judge, I brought this up in the beginning of the speech. You have to keep this in mind and remember it. In the beginning of the round, you have to keep this in mind and remember that we're going to be looking at this round from the eyes of a prospective college student. That's the only logical way to look at this resolution, because that's what this resolution is asking as to how a person can make, whether or not a person should go to college and whether or not it's beneficial for them to go to a community college if it is free and the tuition is free for them. So if you set up those weighing analyses earlier, it's a lot easier for a judge to buy them, and it's a lot easier for you to put your impacts through those weighing analyses. The last thing I can bring up here on the idea of judge adaptations is political skew might matter a little bit with this topic. So if you're from a more conservative area, for districts and states, obviously, the area tends to matter for the judges where they come from. If you were on the pro, stressing that President Obama wants this to happen, that is his plan, might not be a good plan if you have a heavily conservative area that is very against President Obama's general plans. Same thing applies to a more liberal district, just vice versa. If you're from a more liberal district, on the pro, it might be helpful to mention that President Obama wants this to be implemented, or on the con, you might want to avoid saying that, because obviously you want to try to adapt your judge as best as possible. Ideally, though, they should be not biased, and they should be weighing the round on its merits and not on their own views. Alright, so thanks guys. I hope this was helpful. Like I said earlier, if you need any extra help, I would highly recommend doing your own research, but also definitely look into getting the brief for this month. I think Champion Briefs did a pretty good job of putting together some very good evidence and some pretty good arguments that will help you in all of your districts and state tournaments, and hopefully get you to qual to Nats. So good luck. I really liked this topic, and I hope you have fun.